When you die in a cold, fluorescent-lit hospital bed, entirely alone and utterly broken, you expect some kind of peace. You don't expect to open your eyes and find yourself sitting in a leather chair 5 years earlier, staring across a polished mahogany table at the husband who ruined you. I was looking at the exact divorce papers that started my 10-year descent into hell. In my past life, I begged, I fought, I let them bleed me dry. This time, I just picked up the pen and signed without reading a single word. 10 minutes later, his lawyer called me absolutely screaming. The smell of bleach didn't fade immediately. That was the first thing I noticed. My lungs pulled in a jagged, desperate breath of air, expecting the sterile, suffocating odor of the ICU, the sharp ozone tang of the heart monitor that had been my only companion for 3 weeks. Instead, the air filling my chest was aggressively chilled and smelled of expensive floor wax and sandalwood. I blinked. The harsh white overhead lights of the hospital ward dissolved, replaced by the muted amber glow of recessed lighting. I wasn't lying down. I was sitting. My fingers, which had just been wrapped in thin institutional gauze, were pressing hard against the edge of a heavy conference table. The wood grain was smooth polished to a mirror finish. I looked down at my hands. The skin was taut. The brutal purple bruising from blown IV veins was gone. My fingernails weren't pale and brittle. They were painted a deep, chipped burgundy. A low synthetic hum vibrated through the floorboards, the central air conditioning of a high-rise building. Are you even listening to me, Sadie? Or are you just going to stare at your hands all day? The voice hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 2 years, not since he stopped paying the hospital bills, not since he changed his number, leaving me to rot in a public ward while his new startup went public. I raised my head slowly. The muscles in my neck felt stiff, unaccustomed to holding up the weight of my own skull, without the support of a foam pillow. Grant was sitting across from me. He looked exactly as he had 5 years ago. His jawline was sharp, his posture impossibly rigid, wearing that bespoke navy suit he bought in London, the one I had paid for with my meager savings, when we were still pretending we were a team. He was looking at me with that familiar, exhausted irritation, his dark eyes flat and devoid of anything resembling warmth. Beside him sat Pierce, his lawyer, a man whose cologne smelled aggressively of pine and litigation. Pierce had a manicured hand, resting on a thick manila folder. I know this is difficult, Sadie. Pierce set his tone, dripping with the kind of practiced artificial sympathy you'd use on a slow child. But Grant has been more than generous. We've outlined the separation of assets. It's a clean break. The longer you drag this out, the harder it's going to be on your emotional state. My emotional state. I stared at the two of them. My heart was hammering against my ribs so violently, I thought they must be able to hear it over the hum of the AC. I was dead. I knew I was dead. I remembered the monitor flatlining. I remembered the sudden terrifying cold creeping up my legs. I remembered the sheer, overwhelming exhaustion of a body that had simply given up fighting an autoimmune disease brought on by years of chronic, unyielding stress. And yet, here I was, Tuesday, November 14th, the day Grant dropped the papers on me. In my past life, my previous timeline, whatever this fresh hell was, this was the moment my world ended. I remembered exactly how this afternoon had played out. I had hyperventilated. I had knocked over a glass of water, soaking Pierce's sleeve. I had dropped to my knees on this very carpet, right there by the leg of the table, begging Grant to tell me what I did wrong, begging him to go to counseling. I remembered Grant standing up, adjusting his cuffs, and stepping around me as if I were a spilled cup of coffee. I remembered the ensuing 3-year legal battle. I remembered Pierce burying my cheap lawyer in thousands of pages of discovery, draining my bank account until I couldn't afford rent, let alone my medical treatments. They took everything. They left me with a broken body and a shattered mind. Sadie, Grant's voice dropped an octave, weaponizing his impatience. He tapped his gold watch, a gift from his mistress, though I didn't know that yet in this timeline. I have a board meeting at 4. I don't have time for a theatrical performance. Just look at the summary page. I looked at him, really looked at him. The fear that used to grip my chest whenever he was displeased was entirely absent. There was no panic. There was no love. There was only a profound, hollow exhaustion. And beneath that, a dark, muddy cynicism that tasted like copper in the back of my throat. I was 29 again. My body didn't hurt. My joints weren't inflamed. I had my life back. And this man, this incredibly small, arrogant man, thought he was the most important thing in the room. "You're right," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. It wasn't the trembling, reedy whisper they were expecting. It was flat, deadpan, the voice of a woman who had already attended her own funeral. Grant blinked a microscopic flicker of surprise, crossing his face before it settled back into practiced indifference. "Excuse me. You're right," I repeated, dragging my eyes away from him and looking at the thick folder under Pierce's hand. "I don't want a performance either." Pierce's smile was a thin, predatory slash across his face. He clearly thought my compliance was the result of his intimidation tactics. He slid the heavy folder across the polished mahogany. It made a soft hissing sound against the wood. "A wise decision, Sadie," Pierce said, popping the clasps on the folder. "As you'll see on page 4, Grant is willing to offer a lump sum of $50,000 to assist with your relocation, provided you vacate the apartment by the end of the month. In exchange, you waive all rights to future earnings, equity in the company, and any claim to the primary residence. It's a standard, uncontested waiver." In the past, those words had sounded like a death sentence. $50,000 for 10 years of my life. I had worked 3 jobs to put him through his MBA. I had typed his early business proposals until my fingers bled. I had delayed my own career, my own dreams, to build his foundation. Now, staring at the stack of thick, cream-colored legal paper, I didn't feel a shred of indignation. I just wanted to be as far away from the smell of Grant's sandalwood cologne as physically possible. Pierce reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen. He uncapped it with a soft click and laid it on the table next to the documents. "Of course," Pierce continued, leaning back in his chair and interlacing his fingers, "we expect you'll want to have your own counsel review this. But I must warn you, if you choose to contest this offer, expires at 5 p.m. today. After that, we go to litigation, and I assure you, it will not end favorably for you." He was practically begging me to fight. Pierce, billed by the hour. A messy, drawn-out divorce was his bread and butter. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to hire a desperate, outgunned lawyer so he could play cat and mouse for the next 2 years. Grant sighed a heavy, performative sound. "Just take the money, Sadie. Don't be stupid about this. You know you can't afford to fight me." I didn't look at Grant. I kept my eyes on the paper. My hand moved. It didn't shake. I reached out and picked up the Mont Blanc. The metal was heavy and shockingly cold against my skin. It felt real. This was real. I wasn't hallucinating in my final moments. The weight of the pen grounded me in the present. I didn't open the folder to read the clauses. I didn't care about the 50,000. I didn't care about the apartment. I knew from my past life that the company Grant was so fiercely protecting was currently cooking its books anyway. A scandal that would hit the news in roughly 18 months, temporarily tanking his stock before he slithered out of it through a loophole. I didn't want his money. I wanted my time. I wanted my health. I wanted to walk out of this high-rise and feel the cold November wind on a face that wasn't gaunt and gray. I flipped the thick stack of papers directly to the last page. There were 2 signature lines. Grant's name was already scrawled on the left, a jagged, aggressive signature he'd executed beforehand, to prove how little this meant to him. "Wait," Pierce said, his tone shifting slightly, a note of genuine confusion creeping in. "You need to initial pages 4 through 9, the waiver clauses. Where do I sign to just end it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sadie, what are you doing?" Grant demanded, leaning forward, his brow furrowed. This wasn't the script. I was supposed to weep. I was supposed to beg him to reconsider. My immediate capitulation was insulting his ego. "Read the damn document." "I don't need to," I said. I pressed the nib of the Mont Blanc against the thick paper. The ink flowed smoothly, black and final. I signed my name, Sadie Miller, not his last name. I used my maiden name instinctively, the letters flowing from my hand before I could even think about it. I pressed so hard on the final letter that the nib slightly tore the grain of the paper. The sound of that tiny tear echoed in the quiet room. I dropped the pen. It clattered against the wood, rolling until it hit the edge of the folder. I stood up. My knees felt a little weak, a residual phantom memory of my atrophied muscles. But they held. I pushed the chair back. Pierce was staring at the signature page, his mouth slightly open. He looked from the paper to me, then back to the paper. You didn't even read the severance schedule." "Keep the 50 grand grant," I said, looking down at him. From this angle, I could see the slight thinning of his hair at the crown. He suddenly looked so violently ordinary. "Buy yourself something nice. Maybe a soul, if you can find one on discount." I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy glass door of the conference room. "Sadie," Grant barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "If you walk out that door, you get nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." I pushed the glass door open. The receptionist in the hallway looked up, startled by the sudden noise. I didn't look back. I just kept walking toward the elevators, the sound of my own footsteps muffled by the thick, expensive carpet. I pressed the down button. The metal plate felt cool under my finger. When the elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the law firm's sterile lobby, I leaned against the mirrored back wall and let out a long, shuddering breath. I was free. I had nothing, but I was free. I was alive. The street-level air hit me like a physical shock. It was a brutal, damp November afternoon in the city. The sky was the color of a bruised iron skillet, threatening sleet. In my past life, I had dreaded this cold. It used to seep into my bones, aggravating the joint pain that would eventually leave me bedridden. But now I closed my eyes and breathed it in. It smelled like wet asphalt, roasted nuts from a street vendor, and exhaust fumes. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever smelled. I pulled my thin trench coat tighter around my shoulders. I had no apartment. Grant had changed the locks 2 days ago. Another detail I remembered too well. I had whatever was in my checking account, which was roughly $400, and the clothes on my back. I needed coffee. Real, bitter, terrible diner coffee. Not the filtered IV drip fluids I had been existing on for the last year of my memory. I walked 2 blocks letting the cold numb my cheeks until I found a greasy spoon squeezed between a dry cleaner and a vacant storefront. The bell above the door jingled a flat, discordant note. As I walked in, the place smelled of old fryer grease and burnt sugar. It was perfect. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, the synthetic material squeaking loudly under my weight. The tabletop was sticky. A tired waitress slapped a chipped ceramic mug in front of me and filled it with black coffee without me having to ask. I wrapped both hands around the mug. The heat radiated through my palms, stinging slightly. I took a sip. It tasted like battery acid and burnt dirt. I swallowed it gratefully. I was trying to process the timeline. If it was November 14th, that meant my mother was still alive. She wouldn't have the stroke for another 8 months. It meant my old friend Maya, who I had pushed away because Grant didn't like her, was still in the city. It meant I could change everything. My purse vibrated against my hip. I jumped, sloshing coffee, onto the Formica table. I unclasped my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked in the top right corner. The caller ID flashed Pierce and Associates. I stared at it for a long moment. The buzzing felt aggressive in the quiet diner. Why was he calling? I had signed the papers. I had surrendered. I had given Grant exactly what he wanted, a clean break with zero financial drain. There was nothing left to discuss, unless I hadn't signed enough copies, unless Pierce needed my initials on the waiver pages for it to be legally binding in this state. I let it ring 3 times. Then slowly, I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. "I'm not coming back to initial anything, Pierce," I said, my voice steady. "File it as is. If a judge throws it out, draft a new one and mail it to me. I'm done." There was a heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. It didn't sound like the slick, composed lawyer who had been sitting in the conference room 20 minutes ago. It sounded like a man who had just run up 6 flights of stairs. "Sadie." Pierce's voice was strained, stretched so thin it cracked on the second syllable of my name. "Sadie, where are you?" "That's none of your business," I replied, taking another sip of the terrible coffee. "You need to come back." It wasn't a demand. It was a plea. "Right now. Sadie, you need to turn around and come back to the office this second. We need to tear that document up." I frowned. A prickle of unease, completely different from the fear I used to feel, crawled up my spine. "Tear it up? You just spent an hour telling me how generous it was. I signed it. Grant signed it. We're done." "You didn't read it," Pierce yelled. The volume was so loud, I had to pull the phone away from my ear for a second. The cynical, predatory lawyer was gone. He sounded hysterical. "You stupid, arrogant. You didn't even look at the front page." I didn't need to look at the front page to know Grant was screwing me out of 10 years of equity. I said coldly, "I don't care. Let him have it. I just want out." "He's not screwing you," Pierce screamed. The sound of something shattering echoed in the background of the call, a glass thrown against a wall maybe. "Sadie, listen to me." There were 2 folders on my desk, 2 drafts. I stopped breathing. The diner around me seemed to fade into a dull buzz. 2 drafts. Grant was paranoid last month. Pierce gabbled his words, tumbling over each other in sheer panic. He thought you had access to his hard drive. He thought you knew about the Cayman accounts. We drafted an emergency settlement, a containment draft, just in case you hired a forensic accountant and backed us into a corner. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. And I handed you the wrong file. Pierce's voice broke entirely, pitching into a desperate squeak. I handed you Exhibit B Sadie, the containment draft. And because Grant pre-signed the signature page, thinking it was the waiver, and you just signed it and left. My paralegal took it. She took it to the clerk down the hall the second you walked out. It's stamped. It's notarized. It's filed. I sat perfectly still. A drop of spilled coffee dripped off the edge of the table and hit my shoe. What exactly does Exhibit B entitle me to Pierce? There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end. I could hear Grant yelling something muffled and furious in the background. Everything, Pierce whispered, the sound devoid of all hope. You get the house. You get 60% of the liquid assets. And you get half his pre-IPO voting shares in the tech firm. I closed my eyes. The sheer absurdity of it washed over me. In my past life, I had fought tooth and nail just to get my medical bills covered, and they had crushed me into dust. Today, simply because I was too exhausted to care, too broken to read the words on a page, I had just legally dismantled Grant's entire empire. Sadie, Pierce begged. Please. If Grant loses those voting shares before the IPO, the board will slaughter him. We can amend it. I'll give you $1 million, $2 million. Just come back and sign a retraction. I opened my eyes. I looked out the grease-stained window of the diner at the cold gray city. The heavy, oppressive weight that had sat on my chest for 10 years was entirely gone. A slow, terrifyingly genuine smile spread across my face. A deal is a deal, Pierce, I said softly. Tell Grant I'll see him at the shareholder meeting. I hung up the phone and turned it off. The coffee in my mug had gone stone cold, developing a greasy, iridescent film on the surface. I stared at it for a long time, listening to the flatline hum of the diner's ancient refrigerator. My phone, sitting face down next to the sugar dispenser, was entirely silent. In my previous life, I had spent the next 3 days curled in a fetal position on a cheap motel bed, paralyzed by terror, waiting for Grant to call and tell me it was all a terrible mistake. I had let him dictate the timeline. I had let him set the rules of my destruction. By the time I finally dragged myself to a lawyer, he had already moved the money hid in the assets and painted me as unstable to everyone we knew. Not this time. I slid out of the booth. My legs still felt strangely light, lacking the heavy, waterlogged sensation of the edema that had plagued my final months. I dropped a crumpled $5 bill on the sticky table and walked out into the street. The threatened sleet had finally started to fall. It was sharp and tiny, stinging my cheeks like thrown sand. I didn't pull my collar up. The physical discomfort was a grounding wire, keeping me tethered to the present, proving that the lungs pulling in the freezing air were healthy and whole. I had a window. In the original timeline, Grant drained our primary joint, checking and savings accounts, at 9 a.m. the morning after I signed the papers. He claimed he needed to protect the capital during the separation. The judge eventually scolded him for it 2 years later, but by then, the money had been bled away by legal fees. It was currently 3:15 p.m. The banks closed at 5. I power walked 4 blocks to the First National branch. My cheap trench coat was soaked through by the time I pulled open the heavy glass door. The bank smelled of wet wool floor wax and the metallic tang of heated air. It was quiet, save for the hushed murmur of a teller explaining overdraft fees to an elderly man. I walked straight to the mahogany desk of a personal banker. A small brass placard read David Thorne. Wait, I need to avoid Thorne. Let's change the name. A small brass placard read David Hayes. David looked up from his monitor, his eyes flicking over my damp hair and dripping coat with a practiced, polite neutrality. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I need to make a withdrawal," I said. My voice was raspy from the cold. I cleared my throat. "A substantial one, and I need a cashier's check." "Of course. Do you have your account information and ID?" I handed him my driver's license and the debit card Grant had tried to demand back earlier that morning. David typed rhythmically on his keyboard. I watched his face carefully. The seconds stretched. The silence was thick and heavy. Would the account be frozen? Had Grant already called it in? Pierce was a shark, but even sharks needed time to process the paperwork. David's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Okay, Mrs. Miller. I see the joint accounts here, the checking and the high-yield savings. How much were you looking to withdraw today?" I leaned forward. The fabric of my wet coat squeaked against the leather chair. "The current balance of the high-yield savings is roughly $412,000, correct?" I asked. I knew the exact number. I had balanced those books for years. $412,680. David confirmed his tone, dropping to a discreet murmur. "I need to withdraw $247,600. I said, 60%, exactly what the legally binding accidentally filed Exhibit B entitled me to. I want it issued as a cashier's check made out to Sadie Miller." David hesitated. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. "That's a significant withdrawal. Normally for amounts over $100,000 from a joint account, we prefer to have both account holders present, or at least verify. Is it a bank policy or a legal requirement?" I interrupted. I kept my voice flat, holding his gaze. I wasn't the timid, pleading woman I used to be. The ghost of the hospital ward was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I didn't have time for banking etiquette. My name is on the account. I have equal legal access to those funds. If you need to speak to the branch manager to clear it, please do. But I am not leaving without that check. David blinked slightly, taken aback by the sheer lack of emotion in my face. He swallowed, nodded once, and stood up. "Let me just grab my manager to authorize the override. It will just be a moment." He walked away. I stared at his empty chair. My hands were resting in my lap. They were perfectly still, but underneath my skin, a violent electric tremor was humming through my veins. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the bank. The sleet had turned into a steady, freezing rain. Tucked inside the interior pocket of my damp coat, resting right against my ribcage, was a stiff piece of paper worth nearly $250,000. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. 6 missed calls from Grant. 14 missed calls from Pierce. 3 text messages. "Grant, Sadie, answer the phone. Stop acting like a child. Grant, this isn't funny. You're committing fraud. Call Pierce. Grant, I know you went to the bank. I swear to God, Sadie, I will ruin you." I read the last message as a drop of rain hit the cracked screen, distorting the words. A laugh bubbled up in my throat. It was a rusty, ugly sound. "I will ruin you." He already had. He just didn't know I survived it. I turned the phone off again and flagged down a passing cab. The hallway of Maya's apartment building smelled exactly as I remembered, an overpowering mix of stale garlic damp plaster and cheap pine cleaner. The overhead fluorescent light on the 3rd floor flickered rhythmically, casting sickly, strobe light shadows against the peeling yellow wallpaper. I stood in front of apartment 3B, my wet shoes squelched slightly against the linoleum. I hadn't seen Maya in 3 years. In my first life, Grant had systematically dismantled our friendship. It wasn't explosive. It was a slow, insidious poisoning. He would complain that Maya was too loud, too unrefined, that she encouraged my worst habits. He scheduled dinners on her birthday. He made me feel guilty for leaving him alone when I went to see her. Eventually, exhausted by the constant friction, I simply stopped calling her. When I got sick, Maya didn't know. When I was moved to the public ward, I was too deeply ashamed of my isolation to reach out. I died without telling my best friend I was even dying. I raised a trembling hand and knocked on the chipped green paint of her door. I waited. A heavy, suffocating wave of guilt crashed over me. Why would she even open the door? The last time we spoke, I had canceled our weekend trip because Grant wanted to host a spontaneous networking brunch, and I had defended him when she finally snapped and called him a controlling narcissist. Footsteps approached. The deadbolt engaged with a heavy metallic clack. The door opened a few inches, halted by a brass chain. Maya's face appeared in the gap. She looked tired. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy knot, and she was wearing a faded oversized college sweatshirt covered in dried paint flecks. She squinted at me through the dim light. "Yeah," she said, her voice rough. Then she froze. Her dark eyes went wide, flicking over my soaked hair, my pale face, the water dripping from my coat collar onto her welcome mat. "Sadie." "Hi, Maya," I said. My voice cracked. She unlatched the chain and pulled the door open fully. She didn't look happy. She looked deeply suspicious, her arms crossing over her chest in a defensive posture. "What are you doing here? It's Tuesday. Shouldn't you be steaming Grant's pocket squares or whatever the hell you do now?" The barb stung, but it was fair. It was exactly what I deserved. "I left him," I said. Maya's expression didn't soften. "Right. You had a fight. He forgot your anniversary. You'll be back there by midnight apologizing for making a scene. I'm not doing this again, Sadie. I'm not your temporary waiting room until he decides to let you back in. I signed the divorce papers," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He gave them to me an hour ago. He offered me 50 grand to walk away from a decade of my life." Maya stopped. Her arms dropped a fraction of an inch. She studied my face, looking for the hysterical, desperate woman she had known 3 years ago. But she didn't find her. "I'm locked out," I continued, fighting the sudden violent urge to sink to the floor. The adrenaline from the bank was wearing off, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. "I have nowhere to go, and I think I just accidentally stole half his company." Maya stared at me for 3 long seconds. Then she stepped back and pulled the door wide open. "Get in here," she muttered, "before you drip all over the hallway and Mrs. Gable reports me to the super again." I stepped into the apartment. It was small, cluttered, and incredibly warm. The smell of lavender incense and old paper washed over me, a scent so deeply tied to my college years that it physically hurt my chest. Maya locked the door behind me and walked into the tiny kitchen, grabbing a towel off the oven handle. She tossed it at my head. "Dry off. You look like a drowned rat," she said, pulling a half-empty bottle of red wine out of a cabinet. "You don't get the good glasses. You get a mug. Talk." I sat down on her battered velvet sofa. It groaned under my weight. I pressed the rough towel against my face, inhaling the smell of cheap laundry detergent. It was the most comforting smell in the world. For the next 20 minutes, sitting in the dim glow of a floor lamp, I told her everything. I didn't tell her about dying. I couldn't even process that myself, yet let alone explain it to someone else. I just told her about the conference room, about the smell of Pierce's cologne, about the overwhelming exhaustion that made me sign the paper without looking, about Pierce's hysterical phone call, about the Exhibit B containment draft. By the time I finished, Maya was sitting on the coffee table directly across from me, her wine mug forgotten on the floor. Her mouth was slightly open. "So wait," she said slowly, dragging a hand through her messy hair. "You're telling me that Grant, the man who audits your grocery receipts, was so paranoid you were going to hire a forensic accountant, that he pre-signed a doomsday settlement, and his lawyer handed me the wrong file." I confirmed, staring at my own hands. "And the paralegal filed it with the court before they realized the mistake." Maya let out a breath that was half laugh, half cough. "Sadie, oh my God, he is going to literally spontaneously combust. You own half his voting shares. Until he drags me into court to contest it, yes." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the stiff paper envelope, tossing it onto the table next to her mug. "I also took 60% of the liquid cash, 247 grand. I just pulled it out of Chase." Maya stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. She looked up at me, a new, profound respect, mingling with the residual anger in her eyes. "You cold-blooded bitch." It was a compliment, the highest she could give. I tried to smile, but the muscles in my face wouldn't cooperate. Instead, a sudden ragged sob tore its way out of my throat. It wasn't a pretty cinematic cry. It was an ugly, violent shudder that originated in my stomach and ripped upward. It was the grief of a woman mourning her own corpse. Maya moved instantly. She closed the distance between us, sliding onto the sofa and wrapping her arms tightly around my shaking shoulders. She smelled like paint thinner and wine, and she held me so fiercely it grounded me to the floorboards. "I'm sorry," I gasped into her shoulder, clutching the fabric of her sweatshirt. "I'm so sorry I stopped calling. I'm so sorry I left you." "Shut up," she whispered, fiercely, resting her chin on top of my wet hair. "You're here now. You're out. That's all that matters." We sat there for a long time, the silence of the apartment broken only by the sound of rain hitting the window pane and my own jagged breathing. For the first time since waking up in that conference room, I actually believed I might survive this. Then, the harsh electronic screech of the building's intercom buzzer ripped through the quiet room. We both froze. Maya slowly pulled away from me, her eyes locking onto the small beige plastic box mounted on the wall near the door. "Are you expecting anyone?" I whispered, my heart rate instantly spiking. "No," she said grimly. The buzzer screamed again, long aggressive and unrelenting. Someone was leaning their entire body weight on the button downstairs. Maya stood up, walked over to the panel, and pressed the talk button. "Who is it?" Static hissed through the cheap speaker, followed by a voice that made the blood freeze in my veins. "I know she's up there. Maya." Grant's voice snarled through the intercom, distorted and metallic, but dripping with a venom I knew intimately. "Tell my wife to come down here right now, or I'm calling the police." The harsh mechanical screech of the buzzer finally cut out, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Only the hiss of static remained on the intercom. Maya's jaw tightened. She reached for the button, her fingers curled into a claw, ready to scream something foul into the plastic grate. I caught her wrist. Her skin was warm, a sharp contrast to my still freezing hands. "Don't," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. I stepped up to the beige plastic box. It smelled vaguely of heated dust and old wires. For 10 years, the sound of Grant's voice had been a trigger that sent a flood of cortisol straight into my bloodstream. My body still remembered the drill. My chest tightened, and a cold prickle of sweat broke out at my hairline. My lungs tried to take short, shallow breaths, the physical phantom of a cowering wife. But my mind was clear. It was a terrifying, crystal-clear lake of absolute indifference. I pressed my thumb against the flat, gray talk button. The plastic dug into my skin. "Call them Grant," I said into the grate. There was a microsecond of dead air. He hadn't expected me to answer. He certainly hadn't expected me to encourage him. "Sigh, Sadie." His voice crackled back. He dropped the volume, shifting instantly from aggression to the dangerous, patronizing tone he used when he thought I was having a mental episode. "Come downstairs, right now. You are not thinking clearly. You went to the bank and made a terrible mistake. If you give me the money back right now, I will tell Pierce to hold off on filing criminal charges." Criminal charges. I let out a short, dry breath that might have been a laugh. For what? Withdrawing funds from a joint checking account with my own legal ID. "You drained it?" He yelled, his facade cracking immediately. The static popped as he likely leaned his mouth right against the metal plate outside the building. "That is corporate capital, Sadie. That money was earmarked for the server expansion. You are interfering with my business operations." "Your business operations aren't my problem anymore," I said, leaning closer to the speaker. "And neither are your servers. As of 2:15 p.m. today, I legally own 60% of that liquid cash per the settlement you signed." "That document is invalid," he roared. I could hear the muffled thud of his fist hitting the exterior brick wall of the building. "It was a clerical error. Pierce is already drafting the emergency injunction. A judge is going to look at this, see that you stole $250,000 in a manic episode, and throw you in a psych ward." There it was. The gaslighting. The weaponization of my mental health. In the previous timeline, he had used my exhaustion and depression against me perfectly, painting me as a hysterical, unstable burden to everyone in our social circle. I looked over at Maya. She was staring at the intercom, her dark eyes flashing with a violent protective rage. I gave her a tiny reassuring nod. "Get the injunction, Grant," I said softly, my voice perfectly level. "Take me to court. Let's stand in front of a judge. I would love nothing more than to have Pierce explain on the public record exactly why you had a containment draft hiding in your office. I'd love the judge to ask why you were so terrified I'd hire a forensic accountant." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence from the street below. "Let's talk about the Cayman accounts in open court, Grant," I whispered into the plastic. The silence stretched. The only sound was the distant rumble of a passing garbage truck out on the wet street. He knew I didn't have proof, not yet. In my past life, I hadn't even known the word Cayman until the SEC raided his offices 3 years later. But right now, he didn't know what I knew. And for a man whose entire empire was built on a foundation of meticulously hidden sand doubt, was a terminal disease. "You don't know what you're doing," Grant finally said. His voice was no longer angry. It sounded thin, hollow. "You are playing a game you don't understand, Sadie. Pierce is going to ruin you. He will bury you in legal fees until you are begging me for food. Goodbye, Grant. Don't come here again." I took my thumb off the button. The connection severed with a sharp click. Maya and I stood perfectly still for a full minute, listening to the muffled street sounds through the rain-streaked window. We waited for the buzzer to scream again. We waited for the sound of shattering glass downstairs. Nothing happened. 2 minutes later, Maya walked over to the window and pushed aside the faded fabric blind. She peered down at the street. "He's walking away," she murmured. She turned back to me, a slow, incredulous smile, pulling at the corners of her mouth. "He's getting into a cab." He actually left. My knees suddenly lost all structural integrity. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving me utterly hollow. I collapsed back onto the groaning velvet sofa, burying my face in my hands. The rough wool of my damp sweater scratched against my forehead. I wasn't crying. I was just breathing. Huge, deep pulls of oxygen that finally seemed to reach the bottom of my lungs. Maya walked into the kitchen and came back with the 2 mugs. She handed me one. "Drink," she commanded. I took a sip. It was an $8 Cabernet, tasting heavily of bruised plums and cheap oak. It was the best thing I had ever swallowed. "He's right about one thing," Maya said, sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of me, her own mug resting on her knee. The smile was gone, replaced by a grim pragmatism. "Pierce is a monster. I met him once at that awful Christmas party. Remember, the guy looked at the catering staff like they were walking organ donors. If Grant tells him to destroy you, he'll find a way to tie up that Exhibit B in litigation. For years, he'll freeze your assets." "He can't freeze a cashier's check that's already in my pocket," I said, tapping my chest. "But you're right. Pierce will file an emergency motion to invalidate the document based on a mutual mistake of fact. He'll bury me in discovery." "So, what do we do?" Maya asked. "Do you know a lawyer?" I closed my eyes, letting the alcohol warm the back of my throat. I sifted through the agonizing memories of my past life. I needed someone specific. I needed the person who eventually brought Pierce to his knees. "I don't need a lawyer," I said, opening my eyes and looking at the flickering floor lamp. "I need a butcher." Her name was Caroline Weaver. I remembered her face vividly from a front-page article on the Wall Street Journal in 2029. She was the litigator who represented the dissenting shareholders when Grant's tech firm finally imploded. The article had featured a photo of her standing on the courthouse steps, a tall woman in a severely cut gray suit, looking directly into the camera with eyes like chipped flint. The headline had read, "The Architect of the Miller Downfall." She had dismantled Pierce's defense strategy so thoroughly that he had faced a brief suspension from the Bar Association. She didn't just beat her opponents, she humiliated them. "Caroline Weaver," Maya read aloud, squinting at the glowing screen of her battered MacBook. We were sitting at her tiny kitchen island. It was past midnight. The rain had stopped leaving the city, locked in a damp, freezing quiet. Maya scrolled down the firm's webpage. Senior partner at Hayes Weaver and Cole. Jesus, Sadie. Her hourly rate isn't listed, which means it's probably more than my rent. Look at her client list. She defends hedge funds. She handles high-asset corporate divorces. Why would she take your case? Because of who the opposing counsel is, I said, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen. And because of the tech shares. You mean the shares Grant is going to contest? He can contest them all he wants. But right now, I hold the paper. I pointed to the thick envelope resting next to the empty wine bottle. And Weaver is a shark. If she smells blood in the water, especially pre-IPO tech blood, she'll bite. Okay, Maya sighed, pulling up a blank email draft. How do we get her attention? Hi, I accidentally legally stole my husband's company. Please help. Give me the keyboard. I pulled the laptop toward me. My fingers hovered over the keys. In my past life, I had been an exceptional assistant. Before Grant convinced me to quit and manage the household, I had drafted press releases and handled high-level corporate communications. The muscle memory was still there. I kept it brief, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. Subject: urgent retainer inquiry. Uncontested asset transfer / pre-IPO equity Miss Weaver. I am seeking immediate representation to enforce a filed and notarized settlement agreement. Opposing counsel is Richard Pierce of Pierce and Associates. The assets in question include 60% of liquid capital already secured via cashier's check and 50% of Class A voting shares in Miller Tech Solutions, currently preparing for a Q3 IPO. Pierce and Associates mistakenly filed their internal containment draft instead of the standard waiver. They are likely drafting an emergency injunction to claim clerical error as we speak. I require aggressive defense of the filed document. I have $240,000 in liquid, untraceable funds to secure a retainer by 9 a.m. tomorrow. If dismantling Richard Pierce on the public record interests you, I can be reached at this email. Regards, Sadie Miller. I hit send before I could overthink it. The little swoosh sound of the outgoing mail echoed in the quiet kitchen. Maya stared at the screen, then slowly looked up at me. You didn't even leave a phone number. My phone is off, I said, rubbing the back of my neck. Grant knows the number. Pierce knows the number. If Weaver wants the case, she'll reply here. You're terrifying right now, Maya observed quietly. It wasn't an insult. Where is the woman who cried for 2 days when Grant told her she bought the wrong brand of sparkling water? She died, I said. It was the truest thing I had spoken all day. I stood up, my joints popping softly. The bone-deep exhaustion was finally overriding the adrenaline. I need to sleep, Maya. I don't think I've really slept in a very long time. Maya didn't ask questions. She just nodded, shut the laptop, and pulled a pile of thick, mismatched blankets out of a hall closet. She made up the sofa for me, smoothing the worn fabric with gentle hands. Bathrooms down the hall. I left a clean toothbrush on the sink, she said, hovering awkwardly by the armrest. You're safe here, Sadie. The door is deadbolted. I sleep like a rock, but if he comes back, you wake me up, and I'll brain him with a frying pan. I managed a genuine, exhausted smile. Thank you. She turned off the floor lamp, plunging the living room into shadows cast by the streetlights outside. I stripped off my damp clothes, pulled on one of Maya's oversized t-shirts, and crawled under the heavy blankets. The sofa smelled like dog hair, even though Maya didn't have a dog, and old dust. It was lumpy. A spring dug directly into my hip. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 10 years, the darkness didn't feel like a suffocating blanket. It felt like a shield. I didn't dream of hospital monitors. I didn't dream of Grant's cold, flat eyes. I woke up exactly at 6 a.m. The gray light of dawn was creeping through the window blinds. I sat up, the cold air biting at my bare arms. I grabbed the laptop from the kitchen counter, opened the lid, and refreshed Maya's inbox. There was one new email from Caroline Weaver. Time, 5:42 a.m. Subject, urgent retainer inquiry. Ms. Miller, bring the cashier's check, the filed document, if you have a copy, and your ID to my office at 8:30 a.m. Do not answer any calls from Pierce. Do not spend a single dime of that money until we speak. See you at 8:30. CW. I stared at the screen, the harsh blue light reflecting in my eyes. A slow, dark heat bloomed in my chest. Grant wanted a war. He thought he could bully me, bankrupt me, and bury me like he had done before. But he had no idea what was coming for him. I closed the laptop, the sharp click echoing like a hammer striking a nail. It was time to get dressed. I wore Maya's clothes to the meeting, an oversized black turtleneck that smelled faintly of mothballs, and a pair of dark gray slacks that were an inch too long, pooling around the scuffed heels of my only boots. I looked like a woman who had just survived a shipwreck, which, metaphorically speaking, wasn't far off. The law offices of Hayes Weaver and Cole occupied the top 3 floors of a brutalist concrete and glass tower in the financial district. The lobby was aggressively minimalist. No mahogany, no plush carpets, just white marble brushed steel, and the faint, intimidating scent of ozone and espresso. I gave my name to the receptionist. 5 minutes later, double glass doors swung open, and Caroline Weaver walked out. She was exactly as I remembered from the newspaper clipping, just 5 years younger. Her gray suit was tailored so sharply, it looked like armor. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back into a severe utilitarian clasp at the nape of her neck. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, swept over my borrowed clothes, and pale face, cataloging everything in a fraction of a second. "Ms. Miller," she said. Her voice was surprisingly low, a gravelly baritone that commanded instant attention. "My office, now." I followed her down a long corridor. Her office cornered the building, offering a dizzying view of the slate-gray river below. She didn't offer me coffee. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She walked behind a massive glass desk, held out her hand, and said, "Show me the check." I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers brushing the stiff paper, and handed it to her. Weaver inspected the cashier's check for a long moment. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of her mouth. $247,600, drawn from First National. You moved fast. I had a brief window before he realized the mistake. I said, sitting in the heavy leather chair opposite her. The leather was cold, and the document, filed by Pierce's paralegal at the county courthouse yesterday at roughly 2:30 p.m. I don't have a physical copy. They shoved it into my hands, I signed the signature page, and walked out. Weaver dropped the check onto her desk and leaned back, interlacing her fingers. I pulled the docket this morning at 6. Pierce filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order and an injunction at 1 a.m. He is claiming clerical error and mutual mistake of fact. He wants the funds frozen and the tech shares returned to your husband's sole control pending a full hearing. My stomach tightened. A phantom ache throbbed in my knuckles. Can he do that? He can try. Weaver said, her pale eyes locking onto mine. To prove a mutual mistake of fact in a signed, notarized, and filed settlement, Pierce has to prove to the judge that the document you signed was fundamentally different from the agreement you both intended to sign. Which it was, I admitted, my voice dropping. Grant intended to give me $50,000 and a kick out the door. Yes, Weaver said, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. But, to prove that to the judge, Pierce has to submit the intended document into evidence. Exhibit A, the original waiver. I frowned, trying to follow the legal logic through the fog of my exhaustion. Okay, and he has the original waiver. It was sitting on his desk. Weaver's smile finally broke through a sharp, predatory flash of white teeth. Ms. Miller, You mentioned in your email that the document filed was a containment draft. Drafted because your husband was terrified you would hire a forensic accountant. The air in the room suddenly felt very still. The pieces snapped together in my mind with a loud, violent click. The Cayman accounts, I whispered. Exactly, Weaver said, tapping a silver pen against her desk. If Pierce submits the intended waiver, he has to explain under oath why Exhibit B, the containment draft, even exists. He has to explain to a federal judge why his client was willing to surrender 60% of his liquid assets and half his pre-IPO voting shares, just to stop his wife from looking at his books. It's a giant, blinking neon sign pointing directly to financial fraud. I sat back in the chair. The leather squeaked. My lungs filled with a deep, shaky breath. It's a catch-22. If he fights the mistake, he exposes the fraud. If he hides the fraud, he accepts the mistake. Pierce is a bully, but he isn't stupid, Weaver said, picking up the cashier's check. He filed the injunction out of panic. But once I file our response, outlining our intention to subpoena his client's offshore financial records to determine the context of Exhibit B, Pierce will realize he's caught in a bear trap. He'll have to advise your husband to drop the injunction or risk the SEC ripping his tech firm apart before the IPO even launches. She opened a drawer, pulled out a thick contract, and slid it across the glass. My retainer is $100,000 billed against an hourly rate of $800, Weaver said, clinically. I am expensive, Miss Miller. I am abrasive. I do not hold hands, and I do not tolerate clients who change their minds because they feel guilty. If you hire me, we are going for the throat. We will secure your shares, we will secure your cash, and we will bleed Richard Pierce until he wishes he had never passed the bar. I looked at the contract. I didn't feel intimidated. I didn't feel out of my depth. I felt a profound, exhausting sense of relief. I picked up the silver pen she offered. My hand didn't shake. Where do I sign? I asked. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. the following Tuesday in Judge Harrison's chambers. It wasn't a grand courtroom. It was a cramped, wood-paneled room that smelled strongly of old paper lemon pledge and stale coffee. The air was heavy thick, with the heat radiating from the ancient cast-iron radiator beneath the window. I sat at the small respondent's table next to Caroline Weaver. I was wearing a cheap but sharply cut navy blazer I had bought over the weekend. My hair was pulled back. I felt numb, a steady humming vibration beneath my skin, replacing the terror that used to paralyze me in Grant's presence. The heavy oak door swung open. Grant and Pierce walked in. Grant looked immaculate as always. His charcoal suit was pressed flawlessly. His jaw clenched, his eyes radiating a dark, furious energy. Pierce walked half a step behind him, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Grant's eyes locked onto me instantly. He expected me to look away. He expected the old Sadie, the one who would shrink into her chair, drop her gaze to her lap, and quietly hyperventilate. I didn't blink. I stared right back at him, my face entirely blank. A microscopic twitch disrupted the smooth line of Grant's jaw. He broke the eye contact first, taking his seat at the petitioner's table. Judge Harrison, a tired-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses and a receding hairline, entered from his private door and dropped a stack of folders onto his desk. "All right, let's get this over with," Harrison grumbled, opening the top file. "Pierce, you filed an emergency motion to freeze assets and invalidate a finalized divorce settlement based on a clerical error. You claim the document filed Exhibit B was a draft never intended for execution. That is correct, Your Honor, Pierce said, standing up. He used his deep, authoritative courtroom voice, but I could hear the faint, reedy tension underneath it. My paralegal inadvertently swapped the files. My client never intended to surrender his voting shares, or the bulk of his liquid capital. Ms. Weaver, the judge, looked over his glasses. Your response, Weaver didn't stand. She simply leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the table. Your Honor, my client signed the document placed in front of her. Her husband pre-signed the exact same document. It was notarized by Mr. Pierce's own staff and filed with the clerk. The document is legally binding. However, she paused, letting the silence stretch for a single, agonizing second. If opposing counsel wishes to claim this was a containment draft, we are fully prepared to litigate the necessity of said draft. We have filed a counter motion requesting a full forensic audit of Mr. Miller's corporate holdings, specifically tracing capital transfers to offshore entities in the Cayman Islands over the last 36 months. We believe this audit will prove that Exhibit B was not a mistake, but a calculated payoff to secure my client's silence regarding massive financial irregularities. The silence in the chambers became absolute. I watched Grant. The color drained out of his face so fast, he looked physically ill. A dull gray pallor washed over his skin, and a bead of sweat broke out near his temple. He slowly turned his head to look at Pierce. Pierce looked like he had swallowed a stone. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Judge Harrison flipped through Weaver's response, his eyebrows rising steadily toward his hairline. Well, a forensic audit of pre-IPO corporate holdings. That is a massive undertaking, Mr. Pierce. Is your client prepared to open his books to the court to prove this was merely a typo? The radiator hissed in the corner. The smell of Grant's expensive sandalwood cologne suddenly seemed incredibly stale. Your Honor, Pierce finally choked out his voice, practically cracking. He didn't look at Grant. We request a 5-minute recess to confer. Take your time, Weaver said smoothly, leaning back in her chair. They didn't take 5 minutes. They took exactly 3. When Grant and Pierce stepped back into the room, Grant looked 10 years older. The rigid, arrogant posture was gone. His shoulders slumped. The illusion of his absolute power, the myth I had bought into for a decade, dissolved right in front of my eyes. He was just a man, a terrified, greedy little man trapped in a corner of his own making. Your Honor, Pierce said, staring fixedly at the wood grain of his table. The petitioner withdraws the motion. We accept the settlement as filed. Judge Harrison grunted, clearly annoyed by the waste of his afternoon. Motion withdrawn. The settlement stands. Assets remain divided per Exhibit B. We are adjourned. The gavel hit the sounding block. It was a dull, wooden thud. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a fireworks display. It was just a piece of wood hitting another piece of wood. But to me, it sounded like the heavy iron door of a cage finally swinging open. I stood up. Weaver was already packing her briefcase, her face devoid of triumph, merely reflecting the pragmatic satisfaction of a butcher who had made a clean cut. I walked toward the door. As I passed Grant's table, he reached out his hand, hovering an inch from my arm. Sadie, he whispered. It was the voice he used to use when we first met. The soft, vulnerable voice he used to trap me. You're killing my company. Those shares. You know I need them to maintain control of the board. I stopped. I looked down at him. I remembered the cold fluorescent light of the ICU. I remembered the pain in my joints, the terror of the eviction, notices the total, crushing isolation. I remembered the exact texture of the divorce papers he had thrown at me like garbage. Then you better start learning how to compromise, Grant, I said quietly. Because when the shareholder meetings start, I'm going to be sitting right across the table. I turned and walked out of the chambers. The hallway was flooded with bright, harsh afternoon sunlight, pouring in through the tall courthouse windows. Dust motes danced in the beams. I pushed open the heavy brass doors and stepped out onto the concrete steps. The cold city air hit my face. It smelled like exhaust, roasting pretzels and wet asphalt. I closed my eyes, pulled the cold, beautiful air deep into my healthy lungs, and finally let out a long, genuine breath. I was alive, and I had work to do. And that's the end of Sadie's first strike. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't a screaming match. It's letting your enemies destroy themselves with their own traps. Sadie went from a broken gaslit wife to owning half of Grant's empire, all without raising her voice. What did you think of Sadie's raw, calculating comeback? Would you have taken the money and run, or would you have hired the butcher to bleed them dry like she did? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you love this story, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a good revenge plot, and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you never miss another dramatic tale. Thanks for watching, and remember, never sign anything without reading it, unless you've already lived through the consequences.